So yeah, React.Portal. I don't know, this is pretty cool. He's stroking a cat. I don't know what happens in this movie, but there's some really good GIFs out there. I don't know. You might be thinking like, wait, like what's a portal? It's kind of a funny word. There's so many funny words in software. We just keep inventing all these terms, but we'll kind of look at this one. And first, before we explain what a portal is, it's important to kind of understand how React works at a high level and how it kind of renders components. So in React, you start off with a div, usually called like root or app or something like that. And then you render a component or a series of components into that root, which in turn render more components and more components. So you kind of get this tree, if you think of a tree hanging from the top, where like you would put a star on a Christmas tree, you hang it from the top and it kind of just fans out. And these trees can be quite wide and quite tall, depending on your app. And that's sort of the structure of a React application. They kind of hang from one root node and fall down. Well, so what if we wanted to have connected trees? And I'm looking at the slide for my next slide, and it's totally broken, so we'll see if that's not the case. Ugh, all right, don't know what's going on there. Okay, so what if we had oh my gosh, I don't know what's going on there. Let's just go to this slide. Okay, so what if we had like a tree where we had a list component, right? But we wanted to move this list component into a modal or into some other div on the page, right? It didn't make sense anymore to be inside of this root div. We couldn't keep it inside of that. And this is quite common. Like, you can't assume that just a whole page is always going to be an entire React application. And there'll be other reasons why you might want to have a separate div to mount your children in as well, which I'll go into in a sec. So you end up with something like this, where this is how you would do it without using React.Portal. So my volume keeps going in and out. Okay, is that okay? Holding it like that. So say you have this one React app which renders out app and then list, and then you kind of have this little hack where list returns null and then creates a div somewhere else on the page and renders a new React application into that div. Right. So this is how we would do like modals and things like that in the past, where if you wanted to have one React app and then another React app somewhere else on the page and kind of communicating between the two and passing children down into this new section, then you would do something like this. And I coded this just in like a text file, so this isn't real code. There might be typos, but the idea is that from a component, you would return null from your render function. You would like create some other div on the page, and you would use React DOM to like render an entire new application into that div and pass your children into it. Right. So it would have been much more appropriate to choose like the Portal game as like a thing for this talk rather than a Western, but think of a portal like the portal gun. Like this is transporting those children to another div. So even though you're being called like somewhere deep in some tree structure, you're creating a completely new application somewhere else. And you just made a portal, like that's all it is. So well done. We can leave it there, but no, we'll go into what React.Portal is as well. So when would you need a portal? I like this GIF, I don't know, a bit fun. This is from the React docs. A typical use case for portals is when the parent component has an overflow hidden or Z index, but you need the child to visually break out of its container. Other style things they didn't mention there are things like position fixed, or if you have a transform on a parent, or anything like that. CSS has this like nasty habit of some of the styles, like there's no way as a child that you can break out of those styles or be not affected by those styles. And so often moving things into a portal, like another div, often at the end of the body, is a way of getting around having or being immune from your parent stylings. Also, I mentioned this is an approach you would use not just to get around style restrictions, but if you had a page that wasn't just one React app, but several, or if you had say you had one component over here, but you wanted it to touch another part of your page, you might need to use some sort of portaling strategy as well. But this kind of falls down when it comes to React context. So I've highlighted the two boxes here in two different colors, and it's really to kind of show that these are two completely separate applications, right? You've killed one tree and you've created another. You're passing children into it. So yes, the components will be correct, but because it's a new React application, it has a completely new React context. So if you put any like theme, if you're using style components theme, or if you're using the new React 16 theme, or if you're using Redux, all your connected components in this new app will just die. The context is broken. And so what you had in React 15 is you'd have people who would like try and rehydrate the context for this new app. So they'd try and listen for context changes and somehow like create a context wrapper for this new app and like pump new values into it. It's just a huge mess, right? Because the components that are inside that new app don't know, or they like require these context values that just aren't there. So kind of enter React.Portal. So I'm going to talk about some of the good things about it. I'm running on so little sleep as a parent, it's just insane. The good, the bad, and the ugly. So the things that are really good about it, the things that aren't so good about it, and the things that are really bad about it. Really bad? Things to watch out for. I think it's, before I go into it, anytime I have a negative, like, this is bad, I'm like, oh, it makes me feel bad, it makes me feel uneasy. Just respecting that these people put in a ton of work and gave us software for free. So like, it's easy for me to throw stones, but these are just things to be, I guess, to watch out for when you're using React.Portal, the negative stuff. And this is in no way like detracting from the amazing work that they do and continue to do. So this is again from the React docs. So portals provide a first-class way to render children into a DOM node that exists outside of the DOM hierarchy of the parent component, which is what we were doing before with our kind of little like hack of returning null as children and rendering our own app. So here's the good. That was a pretty cool GIF. So I coded this straight up in Keynote. Woo, all right, so that's the React DOM API, like .render, and you pass in, we were passing in the children and you're passing in a portal. The API for create portal is exactly the same. You pass in the children or a component and the node you want it to mount in, and you're all good. What's different is that instead of having to return null from your render function, now you can actually just return the component, like the portal itself. So your render method could just be return React DOM.createPortal, and that's fine. Whereas before you had to do this like ugly hack where you return null and then point it somewhere else. You can just return a portal as a child, so that's pretty cool. So we started off with something that looked a bit like this, and we've moved to a situation like this, where you have one app which has a list component, which now is portaling down into another app, which is mounted in modal, and they actually share context now. So even though they're two like separate apps, I guess, like according to React, they're one thing now, even though they're in different parts of the DOM. And so context just works normally. You can just use context. The components in there will get, all this context will just work. If you're using unstated or whatever it is, it's just gonna work. Which is pretty amazing when they're in different parts of the DOM. They're like, but now React is kind of like smarter about how it's managing those apps, maybe not even treating them as apps anymore, as separate apps. This is great, really, really good. The bad. This is just a little thing, but say you had a component like user, which has focus. Maybe it's an input field, something like that. When you move it into a portal, it loses, sorry. It loses focus. Kind of annoying. Especially if you're doing drag and drop with keyboard and you have something focused with a keyboard and then all of a sudden you move into a portal and it's lost it. It's kind of annoying. I raised an issue about this on the React thing. It's now just, this is a feature request. You can get around it, but it's really horrible. So the idea is that you have to like do all this work. And this is like the summary of it. You essentially add onFocus and onBlur handlers to the component to know if the component was focused. When it's being unmounted, you have to record some sort of state. Like this isn't component state. Like often it's just like in the module that contains the component. That this thing was focused when it unmounted. And then when a new thing mounted, it checks this other thing to see, hey, was I previously focused, like before I unmounted? And if I did, reapply that. And there's so many edge cases. This is just like the summary. There's a lot of like event handlers you have to add because you have to listen for focus changes all over the place. It's pretty horrible. It can be done. If you're interested, you can have a look at, there's like a class or module I created called Focus Retainer inside of React Beautiful D&D. So if you're interested on like how it actually works, you can dig through that. And then the ugly. This is our application, and we want to move user into a portal like we did before. So firstly, and I already kind of talked about this a little bit in the last point, but user, how it works is that user is firstly unmounted, so it's gone. And then the new user component is mounted inside of the portal, okay? This is like so horrible for performance. It's incredible because you had a component that was mounted and now it's being unmounted and remounted, which if your component was something like a list that had hundreds of components in it, you're going to get absolutely destroyed by doing this. So like, I mentioned this before in previous talks, but like if you have a list of like that have items in it and those items have like maybe 10 components in it, just like a normal list of things, mounting a list of about 500 of those with React is about 200 to 300 milliseconds on like a pretty sweet machine. And so if you're moving this thing into a portal, like you jank the CPU for like 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds on a really good machine. So that sucks. So something to be aware of. There's an issue on GitHub, like support for changing a portal's container without remounting children. There's actually a bigger API discussion they're having around reparenting. So this is actually, the core problem is like a reparenting problem. And this happens as well when you conditionally wrap components and unwrap them in components, that the underlying component gets unmounted and then remounted. So there's a proposed API to have this like more optimized reparenting without having to go through the whole unmount, remount. But for now, that's just how it is. Like you can't do anything about it. Which isn't too bad if you're mounting for the first time into a portal. So if you're doing something like a tooltip or a modal, you're putting in a portal, like it didn't exist before you put it in the portal, so you have to mount it anyway. So you're going to pay that cost, so it doesn't really matter. Or if you're only putting in like, say with drag and drop, if you're only putting in like one card or one avatar or one person, it doesn't really matter. It's only a problem when you're putting like a ton of stuff into a portal, especially if it was previously mounted, because you've already paid the cost for that mount and you have to pay it again. So here's kind of a little summary. The good of React.Portal, so you can return the portal in your render, there's no hacks. It automatically manages the mounting and unmounting of it. You don't need to call on mount, you don't need to do anything. You just stop returning it in your render function and it just goes away. Yeah, and context just works, which is amazing because there were so many hacks to get that working before and now it's just a first-class thing. The bad stuff is usually all associated with moving an existing component, so a component that's already mounted into a portal. So bad, it loses focus if it had it, and the ugly, you have to pay the cost, the performance cost of unmounting and remounting that component. So React Beautiful DND, because of that performance problem, actually needs to opt out of React.Portal by default, which I think is pretty horrible. I was so psyched to move to React.Portal with React 16, but now we just say it's a pattern. So you as a consumer, it's like 3 lines of code to do it yourself. And so we just say, hey, this is how you do it. Because like part of this library's DNA is performance. Like we really wanted to have good performance for everyone. And so we didn't want to turn on a feature just for everyone which is going to have bad performance. Didn't want people to opt out. Just wanted it just to be fast. So if you think about this one, when you're dragging around like columns, right, this is where it really falls down. When you have, say, hundreds of things in a column and you drag the column, you have to unmount and remount all of the things in the column, which is not great. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed that. All that said, I would definitely use React.Portal where appropriate, but just some kind of gotchas to be aware of, and hopefully it'll improve over time as well. All right, thanks everyone. Oh, and definitely grab, I mentioned before, but grab a React Beautiful DND sticker on the way out as well. Oh, yes, questions. Yeah.
What's your thought about Redux?
I'm happy to answer the Redux, but does anyone else have portal-related things? Because otherwise I'll get sidetracked and I'll never come back.
Basically, in pure HTML, when you do like a pan child, you definitely don't pay the cost of re-rendering things.
Yeah,
React makes you do it because it's part of architecture.
Yes.
So the option to do it now is kind of opt out of React and do this whole thing and make all this context if you need it and this sort of stuff. So you do like a pan child, which is important.
Yes. Yeah, so you could go back and try and do the old hack of but that still has the problem as well of like if you want to conditionally render in place or mount it into a separate portal, as soon as you switch it to the new portal, you're in trouble unless you're always rendering it. Like, I don't know, I don't want to go there. It's horrible. Managing portals is hell, so you don't want to do it yourself. In the React, like trying to recreate context is something you don't want to do. Redux? We're so quick to throw things out, right? GitHub's being thrown out. Redux. No, it's like totally a tool, like it's a stepping stone, right? Towards like newer things. I think there are like the Redux API is like nothing. The amount of code in Redux is pretty small. It's sort of like saying, do you have a problem with JavaScript? Or like array method APIs. Like there's a lot of them and you can do horrible things with them, but I don't know. The actual API for Redux is quite small and you can get yourself into problems, and I think there are patterns out there that are bad, but at its core, it's just like a state container. So I've seen people do this really well where you effectively hide state containers behind component, like JSX. So if a component really needed like complex state management, it could do that. But unstated kind of fills that hole. I think right now for me the reason why I continue to use it is its performance. Having like memwise selectors is really important. I haven't looked into it much recently, but I know unstated doesn't do it yet, but I think other ones might be trying to do it, but that's just a really big thing for doing especially for like drag and drop kind of stuff. Yeah?
Sorry, what was the other state manager you mentioned just then?
Unstated, which is like a state management library on top of the new React 16 stuff. And I think that performance problem will kind of go away as well. Like little things that I think you miss when you move from Redux as well that are pretty amazing, like middleware. Middleware are crazy powerful and crazy awesome. Selectors, so important to not be rendering components that don't need to render. I think that's really important if you want to do like fast stuff. But there are definitely drawbacks, but yeah. I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater necessarily. It can be used well.
Good summary.